$1 billion disappears from the U.S. Treasury every 24 hours, and nobody blinks. You hear that number, $1 billion a day, and your brain just skips over it. Because what even is $1 billion? It's just a word at that point. It's not real. It's not something you can picture. So let me make it real for you. Imagine your entire city. Every house, every apartment, every school, every hospital. And now imagine the government lighting a match and burning one of those buildings down every single hour. That's what $1 billion a day feels like to an economy. You don't notice the first building. You don't even notice the 10th. But eventually, you look up and half the skyline is gone. And here's what drives me absolutely insane. This isn't new. This isn't unprecedented. America has done this before, spent enormous amounts of money on war while pretending the economy could handle it. And the last time it happened, it didn't just strain the budget. It didn't just cause some mild inflation. It obliterated an entire global financial system that 44 nations spent years building. Destroyed it completely. But sure, this time will be different. It's always different, isn't it? Until it isn't. Let me take you back, way back, to the moment when the world decided to trust America with its money. July 1944. The Second World War is still raging. Soldiers are dying on beaches across Europe. And while all of that chaos is happening, 44 countries send their top financial minds to a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Picture it. The world is literally on fire, and these guys are sitting in a mountain hotel, wearing suits, drinking coffee, designing the future of money. And you know what? What they built was genuinely brilliant. I mean it. The Bretton Woods system was one of the most elegant financial architectures ever created. Here's how it worked. Every participating country's currency gets pegged to the US dollar. Fixed rates. Adjustable, sure, but basically fixed. And the dollar itself? The dollar gets pegged to gold. 1 ounce of gold equals $35. Not 36, not 34, 35. That's the deal. That's the promise. And it's not just a handshake. It's a contractual, institutional, carved-in-stone promise backed by the full faith and credit of the United States of America. They even built 2 massive institutions to guard the system, the International Monetary Fund, whose job was to monitor exchange rates and lend reserve currencies to countries that needed them, and the World Bank Group, originally called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to finance the rebuilding of war-torn economies. 2 pillars, 2 watchdogs, 1 unbreakable system. And the reason everyone believed it, the reason 44 countries said, yeah, we'll trust the dollar, simple. The United States held approximately 3/4 of the world's official gold reserves. 3/4, not a third, not half. 3 out of every 4 gold bars sitting in government vaults around the world were American. Central bank historians described the early system as looking, and pay attention to this word because it's going to come back and haunt us. They described it as looking secure. The system became fully functional in 1958, once currencies became convertible. And for a while, a beautiful, quiet, prosperous while, everything worked exactly as designed. Countries treated with confidence. Currencies were stable. Inflation was manageable. The global economy hummed along like a well-oiled machine. It was perfect. And that's exactly when things started to break. See, there was a flaw, a fundamental, structural, mathematical flaw baked into the system from day one. And the truly maddening part? People saw it. Economists wrote about it. Central bankers discussed it. And everyone decided to deal with it later. The flaw was this. America promised that every dollar was worth a fixed amount of gold. But America was also spending those dollars everywhere. Military bases in Europe, military bases in Asia, foreign aid programs, the Marshall Plan and its aftermath, Cold War commitments on every continent. Dollars were flowing out of the United States like water through a broken pipe. And gold? Gold was barely trickling in. The Federal Reserve System itself described this exact mechanism. A deteriorating U.S. balance of payments, combined with military spending and foreign aid, created a large worldwide supply of dollars. Meanwhile, the gold supply increased only marginally. Do you see the problem? More dollars out there, same amount of gold backing them. Every year the ratio gets worse. Every year the promise gets harder to keep. Imagine you own a restaurant and you've promised every customer a free dessert with their meal. Business is good. More customers keep showing up. But your kitchen only makes 10 desserts a day. When you've got 10 customers, no problem. When you've got 20, you start sweating. When you've got 100 people waving their receipts and saying, "Where's my dessert?" you've got a crisis. That was America, and the dessert was gold. Now, the smart move, the responsible move, would have been to fix the structural problem, spend less abroad, bring the balance of payments under control, maybe adjust the gold price, something, anything that addressed the root cause. That's not what happened. What happened instead was one of the most elaborate, creative, increasingly desperate series of band-aids in financial history, and every single one of them was described, at the time, on the record, as temporary. Where have I heard that before?
March 1961. The U.S. Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund begins intervening in foreign exchange markets again. Basically, the government starts actively buying and selling currencies to prop up the dollar's value. Not because the market thinks the dollar is worth $35 per ounce of gold, but because the government needs the market to pretend it thinks that. Then, 1962, the Federal Reserve builds a swap line network, reciprocal credit lines with 9 central banks: Austria, Belgium, England, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Switzerland, and Canada. By the end of 1962, these swap lines totaled up to $900 million equivalent. And what were they designed as? A small, short-term credit facility. Small, short-term, temporary. Just a little patch to hold things together while the grown-ups figured out a real solution. The grown-ups never figured out a real solution. Instead, those small, short-term swap lines grew, and I'm quoting the Fed's own history here, they grew to be a large, intermediate-term facility. Because the problem wasn't temporary, the problem was structural. And slapping a Band-Aid on a structural problem doesn't fix it. It just hides the bleeding long enough for everyone to forget there's a wound. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because before the swap lines, before the currency intervention, there was a moment, a specific, dateable, terrifying moment when the market screamed that something was wrong. October 20th, 1960.
The London gold market. This is where physical gold actually changes hands. Real metal, real money. And on that day, gold traded at $40 per ounce. 40. The official price, the price the entire global financial system was built on, was 35. That $5 gap, that gap was the market saying loudly and clearly, "We don't believe you anymore." $5 doesn't sound like much, but in a system where the entire architecture depends on a fixed price, a 14% deviation is a fire alarm. It's not a crack in the foundation, it's the foundation telling you it's about to give way. So what did they do? Did they listen to the alarm? Did they address the structural problem? Of course not. November 1st, 1961, the London Gold Pool is formed. 8 central banks, Great Britain, West Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, France, and the United States agreed to pool their gold reserves and coordinate selling to keep the market price at $35 an ounce. Let me say that again so it sinks in. 8 countries, 8 central banks combined their gold reserves just to maintain the fiction that gold was worth what they said it was worth. 8 nations propping up a price that the free market had already rejected. And it worked. For a while. The gold pool sold enough gold to absorb buying pressure and keep the price pegged. Crisis averted. Problem solved. Everyone goes home happy. Except the problem wasn't solved. The dollars were still flowing out. The gold reserves were still shrinking. And now they weren't just shrinking from the original imbalance, they were shrinking faster because the gold pool was actively selling gold to keep the price down. They were burning through the very reserves they needed to maintain credibility in order to maintain the illusion of credibility. The cure was accelerating the disease. Now, I need you to hold two timelines in your head because this is where the story splits and both halves matter. Timeline 1. The financial system is cracking. Band-aids are failing. Gold reserves are draining. Every fix creates a new problem. Timeline 2. Vietnam. The Vietnam War was escalating through the 1960s. American troops on the ground, bombing campaigns, supply chains stretching across the Pacific, and all of it, every bullet, every helicopter, every base, cost money, dollars. American dollars flowing abroad in massive quantities, on top of all the dollars already flowing abroad from foreign aid and Cold War commitments. The Congressional Research Service has a war cost table that lays it out in brutal clarity. At Vietnam's peak in 1968, war spending consumed 2.3% of GDP, and total defense spending, 9.5% of GDP. But here's the detail most people miss. Those CRS numbers only cover military operations. They explicitly exclude veterans' benefits, interest on war-related debt, and assistance to allies. The real cost was higher, always higher than the number they showed you.
America was trying to run guns and butter, fight a full-scale war, and fund massive domestic programs. And the way they financed it was by printing dollars. More dollars abroad, same amount of gold at home. The gap between the promise and the reality wasn't just growing, it was accelerating. And then, March 1968, the London gold pool collapses. 8 central banks, years of coordination, billions in gold reserves deployed, and it all fell apart. They couldn't hold the line anymore. The selling pressure was too enormous. The drain on reserves was too fast. The fiction was too expensive to maintain. Bam! They give up and create a 2-tier gold system. One price for central banks doing official business with each other, another price for the private market, which was, and I cannot stress this enough, an admission that the real price of gold was not $35 an ounce. They just couldn't say it out loud. Not yet. The words were too terrifying. But the market heard it anyway. Every trader, every banker, every finance minister in every country heard what that 2-tier system really meant. The promise is broken. They just haven't made it official yet. The economy was deteriorating in every direction simultaneously. By the end of the 1969 to 1970 recession, CPI inflation had hit 5.4%, and unemployment had climbed to 6%. The Bureau of Labor Statistics crosscheck shows annual CPI inflation of 5.5% in 1969 and 5.7% in 1970. Inflation and unemployment rising together. The economic nightmare scenario. Your groceries cost more, and your neighbor just lost his job. The Phillips curve, the comfortable academic idea that inflation and unemployment trade off against each other, was breaking down in real time. And inside the Federal Reserve, the thinking was complicated. Andrew Brimmer, a Fed governor, was noted by historian Alan Meltzer as viewing employment as the principal goal, with inflation as secondary. Fed Chair Arthur Burns believed inflation pressures reflected forces beyond monetary policy control. Think about that. The guy in charge of monetary policy believed monetary policy couldn't control inflation. That's like a firefighter showing up and saying, "I don't think water works on this kind of fire." The Federal Open Market Committee was operating with an employment-first framing. Jobs before prices, growth before stability, which meant more accommodation, more easy money, more dollars, into a system that was already drowning in them. Everything was converging. The structural flaw from 1944, the Vietnam spending from the 1960s, the gold pool collapse in 1968, the inflation, the unemployment, the intellectual framework inside the Fed that prioritized jobs over price stability. All of it heading toward one weekend, one decision.
One moment that would change everything. August 13th, 1971.
A Friday, Richard Nixon quietly gathers a small group of advisors and retreats to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland. This isn't a public meeting. This isn't a congressional hearing. This is a closed-door, top-secret, weekend session where the President of the United States is going to decide the fate of the global monetary system. In the room, Arthur Burns, the Fed chair, John Connally, the Treasury Secretary, and Paul Volcker, attending as the Undersecretary for International Monetary Affairs. Paul Volcker. Remember that name. In 1971, he's just a tall guy with a cigar taking notes in a conference room. A decade later, he'll become the most feared central banker in American history. But that weekend, he's watching history happen from a folding chair. 2 days, Friday and Saturday. That's how long they deliberated over a decision that would reshape the global economy for the next half-century and beyond. 2 days to undo what 44 nations spent months building in 1944. And then, slowly, Sunday evening, August 15th, 1971. Nixon goes on national television, prime time, and he drops it. The gold window is closed. Foreign governments can no longer exchange their dollars for gold. The promise, the fundamental promise, the bedrock commitment, the thing that made Bretton Woods work, the reason 44 countries trusted the dollar, is over. Done. Finished. Gone. And that wasn't all. He also announced a 90-day wage and price freeze. Just froze everything. You can't raise prices, you can't raise wages. For 90 days, the economy is on pause. Because apparently, the solution to inflation caused by structural monetary imbalances and war spending is to tell shop owners they can't change the number on their price tags. The prices weren't the problem. The prices were the symptom. They tried to save the system afterward. The Smithsonian Agreement, new exchange rates, new bans, new promises. But it was cosmetic surgery on a corpse. Bretton Woods was dead. The fixed-rate, gold-backed international monetary order was replaced by nothing specific, a floating rate system, fiat currencies, money backed by trust and nothing else. The temporary suspension of gold convertibility became permanent. Just like the small short-term swap lines became large and intermediate term. Every emergency measure became the new normal. Every temporary fix became a permanent feature. The promise was always, always that it would be temporary. Now let me show you what happened to regular people. Not to central bankers or politicians or economists who write papers about structural adjustments. Regular people, families, workers, the ones nobody asked. The U.S. Department of Agriculture tracked the retail price of white bread, 1 pound loaf. Basic bread, the kind every family in America bought every week. In 1970, that loaf cost 27.7 cents. By 1974, 39.3 cents. That's a 42% increase in 4 years. And by 1980, 50.9 cents. Your loaf of bread, the most basic staple in the American diet, cost 84% more in a single decade. 84% more for bread. CPI inflation didn't just tick up, it erupted. 1973, 6.2%. 1974, 11%. 1979, 11.3%. And 1980, 13.5%. 13.5%. Your money was losing more than a dime of every dollar in value every year, for years. Picture this. You wake up on January 1st, 1974. You've got $1,000 in your savings account. By December 31st, that $1,000 has the purchasing power of $890. You didn't spend it, you didn't lose it, you didn't get robbed. It just evaporated. And then the next year, it happens again, and again, and again, for the rest of the decade. But here's the detail that makes my blood boil. The U.S. Census Bureau reported median household income in 1973 was $10,500. In 1974, it rose to $11,100. Hey,
That's a raise, about 6%. Your boss likes you. Things are looking up.
Except inflation that year was 11%. 11! So your 6% raise was actually a 4.5% pay cut in real terms. You brought home a bigger number, and it bought you less. The paycheck went up, and your standard of living went down. And most people didn't even understand why. They just knew things felt tighter, more expensive, harder. And nobody on TV was explaining that the reason their groceries cost more was because of a structural flaw in a monetary system designed at a hotel in New Hampshire 3 decades earlier. And the bond market. Oh, the bond market. The bond market is where the real story of consequences lives. On August 13th, 1971, the day Nixon gathered his advisors at Camp David, the 10-year Treasury yield was 6.68%. After the gold window announcement, it briefly dipped to 6.12% on September 3rd. The market initially liked the move. How cute. And then the slow, grinding, decade-long punishment began. That yield climbed and climbed through the mid-1970s, through the late 1970s, higher and higher, until September 30th, 1981, the 10-year Treasury yield hit 15.84%. 15.84%. From 6.12 to 15.84. A move of 972 basis points, nearly 1,000 basis points over a decade. If you had a mortgage, your costs exploded. If you had a business loan, your margins evaporated. If you were trying to buy a house, good luck. The cost of borrowing money in America roughly tripled.
That's not a market adjustment. That's a regime change. That's the bond market looking at everything, the broken promise, the inflation, the fiscal recklessness, and demanding compensation. Massive, painful, economy-crushing compensation. Now, let's talk about right now, today, this moment. Because the whole reason we're telling this story isn't to give you a history lesson. History lessons are useless if you don't connect them to what's happening outside your window. A $1 billion per day war. Let's do the math together. 365 days times $1 billion equals $365 billion per year. Against today's nominal GDP of $30.77 trillion, that's 1.19% of GDP. That's the number. That's what a billion-a-day war costs relative to the size of the American economy. For comparison, Vietnam at its peak in 1968 consumed 2.3% of GDP in war costs alone. So a $1 billion a day war today would be about half the intensity of Vietnam's peak. Doesn't sound so bad, right? But wait, let me scale it the other way. If America fought a war at Vietnam-level intensity today, 2.3% of 2025 GDP, that would cost $707.6 billion a year, or $1.94 billion per day, nearly double the billion-a-day scenario. And World War II? At its 1945 peak, war spending consumed 35.8% of GDP. Scale that to today's economy, $11.015 trillion a year. That's $30.18 billion per day, every day, for the duration. An almost incomprehensible number.
So, $1 billion a day looks manageable by comparison, historically moderate even. And this is where the trap is, because the intensity of spending isn't what breaks you, it's what you're spending on top of. In the 1960s, when Vietnam was escalating, America's debt situation was fundamentally different. Today, total public debt as a percentage of GDP stands at 122.5% as of Q4 2025. 122.5%. Debt held by the public alone, stripping out what the government owes itself, is 98.2% of GDP. Do you understand what that means? Before a single dollar of new war spending, America is already carrying debt that exceeds the total annual output of its entire economy. Every factory, every service, every product, every transaction, all of it, and we owe more than all of it combined.
So when someone says a billion a day is only 1.19% of GDP, they're technically right, but they're ignoring the foundation. They're measuring the weight of the new furniture without checking if the floor can hold what's already there. Current CPI inflation is 2.4% as of February 2026. The five-year forward inflation expectation, the market's best guess at where inflation settles over the long term, is 2.11%. Both numbers look calm, anchored, stable, secure. The 10-year Treasury yield is 4.27%. Normal looking, unremarkable, the kind of number that doesn't make anyone nervous. But remember, in 1971, the 10-year yield was 6.12%, also normal-looking, also unremarkable. And over the next decade, it nearly tripled to 15.84. The 1970s proved definitively, painfully, undeniably, that long-term interest rates can reprice structurally. Not a little blip, not a temporary spike. A fundamental, decade-long repricing that transforms every financial calculation in the economy. And the broad US dollar index sits at 119.49 as of early March 2026. Worth watching, because the Bretton Woods failure was at its core a dollar confidence event. When the world stops trusting your currency, the consequences aren't gradual. They're sudden, and by the time you see them, it's too late. Here's the pattern, and it's the same pattern every time. Step 1. Build the system with a structural flaw. Step 2. Ignore the flaw because the system is working fine right now. Step 3. When stress appears, create a temporary fix. Step 4. When the temporary fix fails, create another temporary fix. Step 5. Call the temporary fixes stability measures and claim the system is secure. Step 6. Run an expensive war that accelerates all the underlying pressures. Step 7. Watch it break. In 1944, the flaw was promising gold convertibility while spending more dollars than you had gold. In 2025, the flaw is carrying 122% debt to GDP while keeping interest rates at levels that make the debt serviceable and praying nothing forces those rates higher.
The band-aids today aren't swap lines and gold pools. They're quantitative easing, yield curve control whispers, and the assumption that the dollar's reserve currency status means America can borrow forever at favorable rates. And maybe that's true. Maybe this time the band-aids hold. Maybe this time the temporary measures don't become permanent. Maybe this time the structural flaw just doesn't matter. But you know what the swap line architects said in 1962? They said the same thing. Small, short-term, temporary. We'll fix the real problem later. They never fixed the real problem. The London Gold Pool members said the same thing in 1961. 8 central banks, coordinated intervention, complete control, foolproof. It collapsed in 7 years. Nixon said the gold window closure was temporary crisis management. It's been over 50 years. The window never reopened. Every temporary measure becomes permanent. Every secure system eventually cracks. And the people who pay the price are never the ones who made the decisions. It's the family whose bread went from 27 cents to 51 cents. It's the worker whose 6% raise was actually a 4.5% pay cut. It's the home buyer who watched mortgage rates triple in a decade. And the people at Camp David that weekend? Nixon, Burns, Connolly, Volcker. They went on to have careers, legacies, libraries named after them. The median household in 1974 just went on buying more expensive bribe with less valuable money and wondering why everything felt harder. Nah, that's how this works. That's how it always works. So, can America afford $1 billion a day war? The answer is the same answer it was in 1965 when Vietnam was escalating. The same answer it was in 1968 when the gold pool collapsed. The same answer it was in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. The answer is, we'll find out. Just not right away. The bill doesn't come due the day the spending starts. It comes due years later, in ways nobody predicted, in places nobody was watching, through mechanisms that the architects swore were secure. And by the time the bill arrives,
the people who wrote the checks are long gone. And someone else, someone who never got a vote, never got a seat at Camp David, never got to weigh in on the decision, that someone opens their wallet, looks at what's inside, and realizes it buys half of what it used to. That's not a theory. That's not a prediction. That's a pattern, exposed, documented, and repeated. And if you've watched this far, you already know what happens next. The question is whether you'll remember this when everyone around you is saying, this time is different. Because it always sounds different. The details change, the names change, the specific mechanisms change. But the math never changes. You can't spend more than you have, promise more than you can deliver, and patch the gap with temporary fixes forever. At some point, someone walks up to the window and asks for what they were promised. And it's not there.
Now you know the pattern. You've seen it play out across decades. You know how it starts, with confidence and promises. You know how it escalates, with band-aids and denial. And you know how it ends, with regular people paying for decisions they never made, with money that buys less every year. Most people will forget this by next week. They'll scroll past the next trillion-dollar headline and feel nothing. The families in 1971 didn't think it applied to them either. Not until the bread doubled. If you'd rather see the pattern before the price tag shows up at your door, Money Never Learns is right here. Subscribe button's right there. Because the next chapter of this story isn't in a history book. It's in your grocery bill.